Neanderthals had fire. They had tools. They had language. They hunted cave lions. They buried their dead. They did everything we did, and every single one of them is gone. Not most, not nearly all of them. So the question isn't what they had that we didn't. That question has already failed you a dozen times, in a dozen documentaries, with a dozen tidy answers that don't survive contact with the evidence. The real question is smaller and worse. It's what we built that they never finished. The answer isn't in their skulls. It's in the distance between them. They knew fire before we did. At Krapina, in what is now Croatia, someone strung eagle talons into jewelry roughly 130,000 years ago, before Homo sapiens had even reached Europe to see it. That's not decoration bolted onto survival. That's a mind with room left over after survival was handled. Their tools weren't crude. Mysterian technology meant hafting a stone point to a shaft, sourcing the right material, sometimes from kilometers away, and planning the whole sequence before the first strike of the hammerstone. That's multi-step thinking. That's forecasting a need before it exists. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, one skeleton belonged to a man blind in one eye, missing an arm, likely deaf, who lived for years after those injuries. Somebody fed him, somebody protected him, somebody decided he was worth the cost. Here's what most people miss about this. Neanderthal skeletons show a pattern of trauma nearly identical to modern rodeo athletes. Repeated blunt force injuries to the head and torso, consistent with close-range confrontation with large, dangerous animals. They hunted cave lions and cave bears at a distance where the animal could reach them. And they walked away often enough to grow old doing it. If you'd shown me this evidence without a label, the burial, the jewelry, the planning, the survived violence, I would have called it modern behavior. I wouldn't have hesitated. Brain volume on average ran larger than ours. Larger, not smaller. By every measure we use to define intelligence, they had it. So why does the genetic record tell a completely different story? Picture a valley in Ice Age Europe, 45,000 years ago. Smoke rises from one hearth. There is no other smoke for 100 kilometers in any direction. That silence is the whole story, if you know how to read it. Neanderthal genomes carry less genetic diversity than a single population of chimpanzees confined to one forest. That's not a difference of degree. That's a different category of isolation. The Shanidar Cave genome belonged to a woman whose parents were as closely related as half-siblings. Geneticists studying other Neanderthal remains found this wasn't a tragic exception. It was close to normal, small, closed groups, breeding within themselves. Generation after generation, band sizes stayed tiny, usually 10 to 30 individuals, and rarely merged with neighboring bands, even when neighbors existed. Tool styles tell the same story from a different angle, the same napping technique, the same stone source, the same design, held inside a 50-kilometer radius for thousands of years without drifting. That last detail stops me every time. Not centuries of isolation, thousands of years, in the same radius. That's not just separation, that's a closed world, one where nothing new arrives and nothing old ever leaves. Every Neanderthal band was an island, sophisticated, capable, isolated. Isolation alone doesn't kill a species. Something has to make that isolation matter. Here's when it did. Now, picture a different fire, roughly the same period, several hundred kilometers away. A woman turns a shell over in her hand. It didn't come from anywhere near this river. Someone carried it here, or traded it, passing through hands that never met each other. This is not a story about language, and it's not a story about coordination. Neanderthals almost certainly had both. This is about something else entirely, a system for trusting people you've never met. Shell beads and ochre moved over 300 kilometers from their point of origin, passed between bands that had no direct contact. At Sungir in Russia, roughly 34,000 years ago, someone was buried with thousands of ivory beads, an investment estimated at more than 10,000 hours of labor, sewn into clothing for the dead. That's not efficient. That's a signal, built to be read by strangers, and tool styles that stayed frozen for millennia in Neanderthal bands moved across entire continents within centuries once Homo sapiens carried them. I want to stop here for a second, because the distinction actually matters. Homo sapiens weren't just trading objects. They were building obligations and identity across distance. Relationships with people they hadn't met yet, backed by nothing but the expectation that it would be honored. That is not a small difference. That is the difference between a single building and a city. One fire destroys a building. A city absorbs it. This was infrastructure. When one node failed, the knowledge, the genes, the people moved. But knowing this existed doesn't tell us when it mattered. For that, we need to go to the specific window when everything collapsed. It's a hard winter, somewhere between 40 and 28,000 years ago. In one valley, a Neanderthal band loses its best hunters to a food shortage that lasts one season too long. No message goes out. None was ever built to. A Neanderthal band absorbed that hit completely alone. No other band knew. No other band sent anyone. No survivors arrived to be folded into a neighboring group, because there was no system built to receive them. The knowledge that band carried died with it. Homo sapiens bands facing the same pressure triggered the network instead. Survivors moved. Knowledge moved. Genes moved. The system redistributed the loss rather than absorbing it in one place until it broke. Neanderthal disappearance wasn't a single extinction event. It was a string of regional collapses spread across roughly 10,000 years, with no recovery in between, because there was no connected population left to recover from a local loss. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens' genetic diversity was climbing during that same window, not falling. They didn't lose a war. They lost one band at a time, in silence, without anyone outside knowing it had happened. Which means the real question isn't why they disappeared. It's why you're still here. You exist not because your ancestors were stronger or smarter or braver in a fight. You exist because at some point, a stranger decided to trust someone they had never met and handed over a shell or a bead or a place by the fire on the assumption it would matter to someone they'd never see again. Every Neanderthal band, as far as we can tell, absorbed its losses alone, because alone was the only mode they'd ever built. The Neanderthals were not a failed experiment. They were a complete one. They built everything a species needs to survive a bad year. They just never built the thing that survives a bad century. You exist because somewhere, two strangers decided to trust each other across a distance that had no reason to be crossed. That is the thing they never finished. That is the only reason this is your history, and not theirs. There's one more piece of this puzzle we haven't touched. The network we just described, the one that absorbed losses, moved survivors, kept knowledge alive across distance. It wasn't the only one. When Homo sapiens moved into Europe, they didn't enter empty space. Neanderthals were already there, and in that window, something happened between the two lineages that neither extinction nor survival fully explains. They met, and the evidence of what happened when they met is written in your DNA right now, in the 1 to 4% of your genome that doesn't come from Africa. That's not a story about isolation anymore. That's not a story about one network failing and one surviving. That's a story about contact. What two different kinds of human do when they finally find each other after hundreds of thousands of years apart. It doesn't end the way you'd expect. I'm building that story next, piece by piece, the same way I built this one. Subscribe if you want to be there when the 2% in your blood finally gets explained. Because once you know what contact actually looked like, you'll never read that DNA statistic the same way again. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.